Hello, and welcome to the Cost of Everything podcast. I am your host, Dr. Amritpal Singh. I have researched cost for a while now, and I'm fascinated with the how and why of the decisions that people make. In this podcast, I talk to the experts in cost, economics, and the decision sciences about these choices. Join me as I find out about the cost of everything. Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast. Joining me is Dr. Rucha Karkarey, a researcher focused on tropical marine biology and coral reef ecology. We discussed the impact of human-induced climate change on Lakshadweep. These are atolls that are similar to the Maldives. We talked about the mass bleaching of coral reefs and how she has investigated the impact on marine life in the atolls. I've learned a lot from this chat with Rucha, and there is so much I don't know about this subject, which has truly global ramifications. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I did recording it. Thank you, Rucha, for joining me today. It's a fascinating subject. I've just been reading up about it now because I don't know much about it.
Hi, Amritpal. Thanks so much for having me and inviting me to this podcast. I'm actually really excited to talk about this topic because it's something I've worked on for the last 10 years, but that's not currently what I'm doing right now here in England. So it's just always a pleasure to talk about coral reefs and marine biology with someone.
Yeah, so I guess firstly, what is your background? I mean, you briefly mentioned it there, but how did you end up researching the mass bleaching of coral reefs?
So, my background, Amritpal, is in marine biology. I've just finished a couple of years ago, done my PhD in coral reef ecology. That's the study of coral reefs and the animals that live on coral reefs. And what I did for my PhD was look at how climate change is impacting coral reefs and coral reef fish. I worked in a lesser known part of India called the Lakshadweep Islands. It's basically a small group of islands just off the southwest coast of Kerala in the Arabian Sea. And interestingly, it forms the northernmost part of a larger island chain, which also has the Maldives and Chagos down south.
Right. So everyone has heard of coral reefs. I think probably more around the Great Barrier Reef. And I know when we previously discussed this, I mentioned the Great Barrier Reef straight away. But can you just take a step back and just kind of give the listeners a bit of a summary of what coral reefs are and what atolls are as well?
So, essentially, when we try to introduce what coral reefs are, I think the easiest way to talk about coral reefs is by giving an analogy of a rainforest. So, if you can think of a typical rainforest in Indonesia, for example, it's full of these tall trees and shrubs of various sizes. And it creates this thick canopy within which different kinds of animals reside, either within the canopy or on top of it or under it. And essentially, that is what a coral reef is. It's the underwater equivalent of a rainforest, where corals are essentially the trees of coral reefs. They come in various shapes and sizes, and they produce this thick canopy within which several fish and various other sea critters survive. And just like rainforests, they are found mostly in the tropical belt, that is within the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn around the equator, where the temperatures are warmer. And as you know, people here would think of the perfect holiday destinations during winter. Yeah, that's what coral reefs are. Essentially, an atoll is a very specific kind of an island. And what I'd like you to do is visualize sitting on an island in an atoll, sorry, in the Maldives. Have you been there, Amrita?
I have never been to one.
Okay, so I'll just do a small visualization exercise with you. So imagine you're sitting on this large sand spit in the middle of the ocean. You're in a bungalow on a sand spit, and around you is this shallow water, which is azure in color. It's clear, it's full, it's teeming with fish. And let's say about 500 meters from where you're sitting on that island, you see waves breaking, and the color of the water changes because essentially it becomes deeper, and that's the open ocean. So, what you're sitting on is what an atoll looks like. It's a type of island. And the way these atolls are created is they're essentially the tip of underwater mountain ranges which jut out of the water. And then, in way back in time, in geological time, they had coral reefs growing around them. But over time, through normal erosional processes, these steep tips subside. And what remains is basically just a sand spit, which is surrounded by shallow water, which is then surrounded by a coral reef. And yeah, so that's essentially what an atoll is. And you know how you visualize up in the distance, 500 meters from where you were sitting, there were waves breaking, but the but the lagoon was more or less very calm. And that's the function that coral reefs play around these atoll systems. They sort of provide a barrier to the open ocean, the waves that come from the open ocean, so that the island remains intact where you're sitting. And you know, when we're talking about climate change and coral reef degradation that's happening at the current rate, it's essentially that physical barrier that's breaking down. And then you have those waves that are coming closer to the water, closer to where human habitation is on these islands. And that's basically the physical impact of how what happens when coral reefs are lost in these systems.
Just going specifically to around Lakshadweep, and what are the specific issues around that particular atoll, and what makes it so special?
So in general, I think we're familiar with how global warming is impacting coral reefs, right? People are talking about how there's temperature, how temperature is atmospheric temperature is increasing, how sea surface temperatures are increasing, and that's sort of creating these massive global scale die-offs of corals all over the world. And the second thing that's often discussed is ocean acidification. So, this is because more carbon dioxide is getting absorbed by the water. This is making the water more acidic and therefore a little more difficult for animals, especially corals, to survive in. So, these are sort of global challenges that are impacting coral reef systems everywhere, even in the Lakshadweep. But more locally, there are other issues that are affecting reefs. So, for example, overfishing, people using or exploiting fish more than required for local consumption. There's pollution or runoffs from human habitation that are polluting the lagoons, and especially and the introduction of invasive species. So species that are not native to those coral reefs that may have been brought in from, let's say, shipping, for example, or through ornamental aquarium trade that are getting introduced in the water and completely changing the dynamics of the animals that live there. So in Lakshadweep, what I have been studying these last few years through my PhD is primarily the impact of how warming oceans is creating these massive scale die-offs of corals in Lakshadweep, and how the loss of these corals to climate change is impacting the fish that survive among these corals. So if you can think about, it's always easier to give analogies that are based on land. So if you can think of a rainforest that has recently been logged for setting up, let's say, an agricultural production of some sort. So you've lost all your trees, you've lost your canopy. So where do all these animals that once lived within that canopy go? So those are the kind of questions that I have been researching in Lakshadweep.
So again, another phrase that I came across when I was just doing a bit of reading ahead of this was rapid human-induced environment change or environmental change. Could you go into that a little bit?
Okay, so just to give you an example of mass bleaching events, and I'll explain a little what these are. So essentially, it's when seawater temperature rises by a couple of degrees, and this condition lasts for several weeks or several days. And initially, the corals are really stressed because the water is so warm. But over time, that stress, some of them just die because they're not able to cope with that kind of heat stress. And this happens on reefs used to happen on reefs at smaller scale. So let's say maybe a few corals in like a 10-meter square area suddenly felt a kind of heat stress and they died. So these things are normal or used to be normal. But what's happening now, more recently in the last few decades, is that first of all, it's happening at a global scale, not a local scale, not a few reefs or few patches of reefs in a certain area, but all reefs all over the world. um, and it's happening more frequently. So the first really large or global scale mass bleaching event that was documented was in 1998. And you had reefs from all over the world that recorded like a 60 to 80% die off of all their corals. That's substantial, right? And then over a period of the next 10 to 15 years, many of these reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef, etc., managed to recover from that kind of mortality. Just because, new coral babies were produced, the corals that weren't dead but were just stressed managed to recover, that kind of a thing. But then from the 2000s, these large scale mass bleaching events have started happening every 6 years, every 4 years, and especially in the last 5 years. You can see that they're almost happening every year during summer, as is the case of the Great Barrier Reef, you know. So that's so what was natural before is being so much more accelerated because of global warming. And it's important to know that this is not the only pressure that coral reefs are sort of facing. You have global warming, yes, but you also have these local pressures, like I said, pollution, there's overfishing, there's, infrastructural developments which are dredging entire coral reefs, things like that. So there's a lot of stresses suddenly that they need to adapt to or that they are facing. And that's what the challenge is right now in trying to understand how reefs are responding to these changes on the one hand, and on the second hand, how these can be managed in the face of all these changes that are taking place at the same time.
Right. So just to go to that, what is the current scientific research, or what has your research shown about the impact of climate change and this mass bleaching, not just on the reefs but on the marine life, and if it can be generalized to sort of the world's oceans?
Yes, so I can talk a little about the work that I specifically did in the Lakshadweep. Um, so this was a really unique place because to study climate change, because like I mentioned, in many of the reefs, you have climate change impacting reefs on the one hand, but you also have human pressures like fishing or pollution or dredging, etc., happening at the same time. So whatever you study, it's very difficult to tease apart whether the effect is because of climate change and mass bleaching events or these other drivers, right? But in the Lakshadweep, we had this unique opportunity to study climate change in isolation because people were not fishing the reefs as much. They had other sources of livelihoods that weren't as dependent on reefs or reef fish. Tourism was not very huge. Infrastructural development projects were not happening at a very large scale. So we had a system where we could actually attribute any differences that we see underwater to climate change quite easily. And so I decided, it would be great to look at how climate change is impacting coral reef fish in the Lakshadweep. That's why I decided to study this. Yeah, so the two things that I looked at for my PhD was essentially trying to understand which varieties of fish or which species of fish are impacted more by climate change and habitat degradation that's caused because of these mass bleaching events. Essentially, trying to understand who are the winners and who are the losers. And secondly, I was looking at the winners specifically and trying to understand what are the strategies by which they're able to cope with mass bleaching events and habitat degradation. So that was essentially what my PhD was about. And more recently, after my PhD, I spent 2 more years there conducting another project. And I was trying to look at the range of functional traits that remain in these reefs that are severely affected by mass bleaching events. And I'll explain that a little. Amritpal, I'll just play a little game with you. So, if you want to build a house, who are the kind of contractors and people that you need to build your house?
People in, well, firstly, you get people to design it, then you get experts in to do the groundworks, make sure the foundation's right, and then you get experts in bricklaying, in internal sort of fixtures and fittings, electrics, plumbing. Then you get experts in finishing, plastering, painting.
Perfect. Right. So you need a whole range of people that, play specific roles in building your house. So they have certain functions. And so, very similarly, on a coral reef, to keep it healthy, you have different kinds of fish that play different roles. You have gardeners, you have detritivores, or the things that feed on dead organic matter. You have predators, you have different kinds of fish that play different kinds of functional roles. And so, what habitat degradation because of mass bleaching events does, I spoke a little about how forests are logged and you lose the structure and canopy that trees provide. So when that happens on coral reefs, which are the species that we lose and what functions are we losing? So, for example, in your little team of people who are building your house, suppose all your carpenters are down with some sort of disease and they're not able to come. Would you be able to do, it's a significant function that won't be able to be fulfilled in your house building, right? And maybe the electrician can do a bit of woodwork, but would it be as effective or as good? Maybe, maybe not. So that's the kind of question I was asking of coral reef fish that continue to survive in these degraded reefs. What are the functional roles they are playing? Whether the functions that they're playing are effective? Yes, so that's what I was studying. So overall, what I find, and this is something that people all over the world are finding on most reefs that they are studying that are undergoing climate change related degradation, is that the the number of there's a lot of losers. There are few species that manage to survive, and also there's this loss of function, and that's what is very important, because when you lose function, it's very difficult for a reef to naturally recover, even if it even if the stressors are removed. That's what I was finding in the reefs in Lakshadweep as well, which was quite alarming considering this is just climate change. So, can you imagine if on top of this you add fishing pressure, if you add pollution, if you add infrastructural development that is being planned in the Lakshadweep right now, how much more stress can these reefs take?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the combination is almost having quite a significant compounding effect on that. So, I mean, what's interesting there is that you've also stated that there's winners and losers. I think often there's quite a lot of doom and gloom around the fact that there is climate change. And again, this is not trying to say that it's fine, everything's going to be fine, it balances itself out in the end, because it's a delicate balance, and the effects of man-made climate change have thrown that balance way beyond anything that's delicate. So how do you measure that something is being more successful? So do you benchmark it from a previous performance? What sort of indicators do you use to measure the performance of a species?
Absolutely. So actually, what you said is so important right now. A lot of what when we talk about climate change and biodiversity loss is very alarmist. So we focus a lot on the species we are losing, the amount of stuff we're losing, etc., etc. But again, I had a mixed bag of responses where I did find quite a few species surviving relatively well in these coral reefs. And so what I looked at was over a period of 10 years. So this was between the 98 bleaching event and the next bleaching event, which happened in 2010 in Lakshadweep. And I looked at things like the number of fish in a particular area. So the first indicator I used was numbers, essentially tracking numbers through time and seeing which species are increasing, which species are declining. The other few indicators I used was one was looking at behaviors. So, for example, if you think about a tiger, and it ambushes its prey, right? It hides behind structure, it slowly creeps onto its prey and then pounces on it and kills it. But if you think of a cheetah, you can see it running for really fast over a long period of time, chasing its prey, tiring it out, and then capturing it. So these are two very different foraging strategies. One is ambush, one is active chase. And so, what we found, and what I found through my research, is that when you lose corals, when you lose the structure in a reef, it's these animals that rely a lot on these ambush strategies where you're stalking your prey, where you're trying to hide and get close to your prey. Those are the species that we were, declining in numbers more than the others. But the species that, like sharks, that chase their prey over a longer period of time and are able to catch it, were the ones that were being really successful in these reefs. So these were the other indicators that I looked at. So and there's another thing that I found, that there were some species that were really good at using both strategies. So if there's structure, they would use ambush strategy. If there's no structure, they could quite easily and effectively switch to a roving strategy. And so these are the ones that were being successful in terms of their numbers, in terms of their growth rates, in terms of their weight in degraded reefs. So these are the kind of indicators I used, and I looked at changes over a period of 10 years.
Right. So, I mean, what that's quite interesting. That I mean, that in such a short space of time, there are indicators of changes in behavior and adaptability. I guess it's not evolutionary. It's basically about different conditions and something having already evolved to deal with different conditions and trying to adapt it. Now, if the coral reefs disappear completely, then that's a completely different situation, isn't it? They're not going to necessarily adapt if their environment completely changes. So that's really interesting, that you've already identified some adaptability of species. I think just taking a step back and looking at the man-made sort of impact, and we discussed the development on the island, how tourism's impacting it, as well as climate change and I think ocean acidification. How are people, organizations, or the government, because this is an Indian atoll, how are they trying to, or are they trying to combat the impact on people who live there and the marine life? So how are they trying to combat that change?
Yes, so I wanted to mention. So I was looking at a very small part of climate change impacts, which is essentially looking at how fish underwater are faring. But I was part of a team that was studying the question more broadly. So they were asking, how is climate change and the loss of reefs impacting the livability of people on these atolls in Lakshadweep, or how is it impacting their livelihoods? How is it impacting how land is being lost on land, for example? And you know of course, we're not the only organization that was working there. There's people locally, a lot of local scientists from the Lakshadweep that have been doing pretty much the same. So combating the impact is something that's very difficult, because it's essentially being driven by stuff that's happening in the global north largely, but the impacts are being felt more locally in Lakshadweep. And I'd like to give you two examples from the Lakshadweep context. So, over time, people noticed that the beach dynamics in Lakshadweep changed quite a lot. So, on the eastern sides of islands, there was a lot of erosion and beach was being lost, while on the western aspects, beaches were being gained. So, what do you do about this? And clearly, the cause of this was degrading coral reefs, because this started happening after the 1998 bleaching event. So the government came up with the idea of putting tetrapods. Do you know what tetrapods are? These are these large concrete structures that you put along coasts, so that to stop the waves from reclaiming more land. And so they went and deployed these tetrapods along the eastern side, and maybe even along the western side of most islands. And what they didn't think about at that time, or maybe they thought about but didn't think it was important, was that a lot of these beaches were also green turtle nesting sites. So a lot of the turtles used to come ashore along the beach, lay their eggs, through the year. And that completely stopped, because they've gone out and they've put these concrete blocks to stop land from getting eroded. But they've completely forgotten about the turtles that use that landscape. So that was one solution. Another solution which we spoke about was these coral restoration projects. They are really very expensive to execute. The science is not there yet. We don't know the success rates, but most governments, most agencies are promoting this because it sounds like a technological solution to habitat degradation. And although you can maybe restore smaller patches of reefs, can you do it at an entire scale of an island? It's not known. So it's very easy to think of technological fixes, to climate change, etc. But I feel that could be misleading. So there's a lot of work emerging right now where people are talking about strengthening these local institutions of resource management, strengthening people's livelihoods, creating alternate livelihoods so that people don't have to depend as much on coral reefs, or also supporting, governments and local communities to for better governance when it comes to coral managing coral reefs. So these are maybe ideas where if we had money, we could siphon money to these initiatives more than technological fixes. Is all I would say.
I guess, like we just said before, that if you try and resolve one problem, and then you cause a knock-on impact, are you necessarily helping the situation, or are you choosing the lesser of two evils? By doing action, you're saving something which you think will have a more beneficial impact on the ecosystem, and allowing another problem to arise, and accepting it. I think that's something which, I think it's eye opening, that there is no easy fix. I'd say, and that a lot of where the impact is coming from, I feel that there is very little attention.
So, just the point I wanted to highlight is that often, when you think about climate change, the cause is somewhere, but the effect is somewhere else. And the burden of adapting to climate change, habitat degradation, etc., falls squarely on people who, don't know. Um, in these remote areas like low-lying atolls who are at the front of the climate change crisis. And I'm not sure whether a few years ago there was a report of Kiribati about how certain islanders had to basically be evacuated from certain atolls because they were completely rendered unlivable because of climate change, because of sea level rise, because their fresh water was inundated by salt water, because their reefs degraded. And so when we're also talking about money and how it can help, the grim reality is a lot of these low-lying island states might have to purchase land somewhere else, to relocate all their citizens. And that's definitely something in the Lakshadweep. The team that I was working with was trying to discuss with the government that this is probably a necessary step you all might have to take, uh, maybe in the next 50 years, where several of your islanders might have to be evacuated and resettled on the mainland. And I just want to leave you with a conversation I had with one of my very dear friends from Lakshadweep. And we were joking about how, he wanted to send his son to the mainland to learn, to study and, settle there. And I asked him very jokingly, I said, so, and what about you? Are you thinking about moving to the mainland, buying a house there? And he looked at me and he said, Rucha, I'm a fisherman. I'll be a nobody on the mainland, and that really struck me because you're not just losing coral reefs. These are entire communities whose cultural identity is so linked to that place that they can't even imagine what they'll be if they're relocated. So it's quite devastating when you hear about how whether these communities will be able to, adapt to something that's not even their fault. It's quite sad.
Yeah, absolutely. That's again, it's quite stark then when you come to the realization that this is, within our lifetimes, another sort of humanitarian crisis, and sort of this is where the issue, I think, with climate justice comes in, where these are impacting people who, haven't caused it. So, why, again, who has to pay in that situation as well? Why should it be the people impacted by it who haven't actually caused this situation? I think that's and I think it's an amazing place to kind of leave the discussion. I think it gives a lot of people pause for thought. And again, I think if you can just give the listeners an idea of how they can find out more or follow your work, that'd be great.
Sure. So, if you want to know about what's happening in the Lakshadweep Islands in India, you can look at the work by the Nature Conservation Foundation. This is the organization I worked with through my PhD, and they've been in the Lakshadweep for the last 22 years, trying to understand these long-term changes in ecosystems and the social systems through climate change and other factors. And I'll share the website with you, Amritpal, on your blog, and you can look at the research they are doing. Some of my research is featured in their work as well. There's another organization called the Dakshin Foundation that work in the Lakshadweep, and what they're trying to do is work with fishing communities and trying to get green certification for their pole and line tuna fisheries. So if you've ever purchased a can of tuna, you have this certification uh, on the label saying it's sustainably caught using pole and line fishery. And so that's the kind of work they're doing with fishermen in Lakshadweep, trying to get them that certification so that they can get better prices for the tuna catch. Again, it's a really nice organization, and I'll share their website with you as well. And so my work, a lot of it you can follow on Twitter. I'll share my handle with you. I keep posting about the work I'm doing, the articles I'm writing, and you can follow my journey there as I hopefully get back to studying coral reefs in India soon.
Absolutely brilliant. And just again, thank you for joining me. It has been a really interesting insight into a world I don't think many people really give enough attention to. So I really appreciate you taking the time to give us such an insight.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
And that's the end of this episode. A huge thank you to Rucha for giving up her time to discuss something that I think is important for everyone to be aware of and to be conscious of. Don't forget to leave a comment so that I know what you thought about it and so that we can generate a bit of a discussion. Thank you again for listening, and I really hope you have a great week.